Tonight's guest is Eve Ensler, the award-winning playwright best known for her groundbreaking work The Vagina Monologues, based on interviews with 200 women. In the 16 years since it was written, it's been translated into 40 languages and performed in 140 countries. The stage play spawned the V-Day movement to end violence against women, which is working with survivors of rape and torture in poor and war-ravaged communities worldwide. Eve Ensler is here to deliver the Australian Human Rights Centre's annual lecture in Sydney, and she joined us in the studio a short time ago. Eve Ensler, thank you for being with us. You wrote the Vagina Monologues some 16, 17 years ago, and to those who aren't familiar with the work, it would almost sound pornographic or at least comedic, but it's neither of those things, is it?
No. I think it's interesting because I think when I first started doing the play and uttered the word vagina publicly, it was scandalous and people were horrified. I used to joke that you could say Scud missile or nuclear war or, plutonium death anywhere on the front pages of any, but if you said vagina, the whole world went crazy. And when in fact it's, a biological, it's a part of your body. It's the place where we all come from. It's, very human, very natural. And I think part of the reason of doing the play was that so many women I had interviewed had not only not said the word vagina, they never saw their vaginas, they didn't know what they looked like, they didn't know how their vaginas functioned, they didn't know what gave them pleasure, they didn't even know that their vaginas were their own. And I think when you name things, you bring consciousness to things, and you bring thinking to things, and you bring transformation. And it's been amazing to watch this journey unfold over these 15, 16 years of uttering the word in many, many, many places. I think we're in 140 countries now, and each time that word gets uttered, a silence gets broken, a taboo gets, eradicated. And I think, I like to believe women get free.
And in some of those countries where the play is now showing, there wasn't even a word for vagina, as I understand.
Not at all. As a matter of fact, in Hebrew, when the production was done there, they couldn't find a word. They had to borrow an Arabic word. In China, the first productions were shut down because the only words used for vagina were really filthy and derogatory words. And it's interesting to see, even the word vagina itself in Latin means a sheath for a sword, so that the word vagina only exists in relationship to a penis, doesn't have an independent identity or meaning, which I find quite interesting.
Now, a lot of the stories that the Vagina Monologues were based on are very unsettling, stories of abuse and violence. For most people who hear that, obviously, it's an awful thing to listen to. But for you, it was also a personal journey, the writing of this, wasn't it?
Well, I want to also say that there's funny stories in the play, too, so people don't get scared off. It's about pleasure, it's about desire, and it's also about what happens to our vaginas in the dark. Really, I think one of the reasons that violence is allowed to go on is because we don't have agency over our bodies, and we don't have a way of articulating what happens to us, and so it all happens invisibly. For me, as a child, I grew up in an upper middle class family. Everything looked wonderful from the outside. My father was a corporate president, and inside he was a very, very violent person, and he was sexually abusing me constantly. And yet there was no way to articulate that. There was no one to tell that to. There was no way to even imagine I had a right to say that was happening to me, because my father owned my body. I was his property. He was the patriarch. He was the dominant person. He was paying the bills. And I think that led me to kind of have suspicions that there might be other women who were suffering the same thing. When I started to perform the Vagina Monologues, it was shocking what happened. Because after every show, women would line up, and it wouldn't matter what country, what city I was in, there would be lines of women. At the beginning, I thought, okay, they'll be telling me their wonderful stories of pleasure and their great orgasms. But no, in fact, 99% of the women were lining up to tell me that they'd been raped or beaten or suffered incest or been mutilated and it was completely overwhelming. It was completely, I was going to stop doing the show because I felt the way a war photographer feels, you know, who witnesses horrible events and doesn't intervene on people's behalf. And in 1998, I got a group of friends together and I said, okay, I've got this play. There seems to be an epidemic of violence against women. How could we use it to end the scourge, to really stop violence, not manage it, not contain it, but end it? You know, see a world where women were safe and free and could wear what they wanted to wear and walk where they wanted to walk and be who they wanted to be and live the lives they wanted to be without fear of attack or harassment or rape or innuendo or whatever it is that makes you feel less than you want to be as a woman.
There's been a lot of discussion in Australia just in this past week, actually, about our Prime Minister, who is a woman. It's not violence that's been levelled at her, but more the tone in which the coverage of her policies and politics has taken a very kind of sexist or misogynist tone. Is that something quite particular to female leaders around the world?
I think it is. I think it is. I just remember during Hillary Clinton's campaign, it's always about the clothes, it's always about the hair, it's always about how she looks today. And I think what happens to women a lot, I think, particularly when they're powerful, is the way the media, the way the world reduces them is to focus on these very shallow, these very superficial, these very insignificant aspects, as opposed to the brilliant and wise and visionary things that they're saying. And I think that's very clever, because it gets women then to focus on these very insignificant things about themselves, like their body, and being skinny, and worrying about aging, and worrying about fat, and worrying about... So that then women end up spending their days fixing this little country, as opposed to fixing the world.
One interviewer just last week asked our Prime Minister, does she cry often? Is that a question you expect to be asked of men?
Well, I wish it was asked of men, and I wish men were crying more. You know, I think often we see these questions about emotions as reductive questions, you know, as opposed to seeing that the problem of the world from my point of view is that it's all head and no heart. And until we have head and heart together, it's very difficult, for example, to have empathy if you have no heart, right? How is it capable that we're witnessing the amount of rapes and massacres and genocides and atrocities that we're seeing in the world without people responding to that? And part of it, I think, is that we bring up boys to be bifurcated, to cut off their hearts and their heads, so that they're then capable, once they come into power, of doing very terrible things without feeling.
You talk about something you call the girl cell, and you talk about the fact that it's been suppressed over time, not only in women but in men. What do you mean by that? And you also say that that's part of the reason we see so much conflict and disaster in the world.
You know, I spend a lot of time with rape survivors. I spend a lot of time listening to the stories of atrocities. Too much time, way too much time. And I think to myself, how did a man end up participating in a gang rape of a 5-year-old girl? How did a man, in stories in Congo, cut out a woman's baby out of her belly and destroy her? What was going on in that man that allowed that to happen? And it has to be that through the processes of patriarchy and colonialism and enslavement and impoverishment, that people end up getting further and further and further and further removed from their hearts and from their empathetic selves. And I think if we really are serious about changing the world and ending violence against women, we all have to come back into our bodies. We have to come back into our hearts, not separate from our heads. We need our intelligence, we need our thinking, we need all of our factors, but together, not separated. And I think it's very hard, because when you're bringing up boys, that whole thing about, man up and be tough and be a guy and whatever that means. And what it usually means is don't cry, don't have your feelings, don't express doubt, don't ask for directions, and that's a metaphor, by the way. Don't act as if you don't have all the answers, which you don't. I think the tyranny of patriarchy has been much more devastating for men in the end than it has been for women, because it's really distanced themselves from their own souls and hearts.
You also talked in this lecture, I heard you discuss the girl cell. You said to be a man is not to be a girl, to be a leader is not to be a girl. Obviously, we have a female Prime Minister, so we have an interest in this particular argument. Is it that women, you believe, need to act as men to succeed as leaders, or they believe they need to act as men, behave like men, react as men would?
I think the media and the world is still a very patriarchal world. So I think as women run for leadership roles and move towards leadership roles, they begin to believe, and I think we really saw this with Hillary Clinton, you know, that there was this kind of unconscious story, which is if you behave like a man, you will move towards power. But the question is, what kind of power are you moving towards? You know, it's the same kind of power that men have, which is the power to dominate, the power to control, the power to rise above, the power to... And it's not the power I'm interested in. I'm interested in the power that includes, the power that feeds, the power that sees all the people at the table, the power that is moved by heart, so that, for example, I was just in Congo for the last month, where we were at the first graduation of a place V-Day opened called City of Joy, which is the most beautiful place I've ever been. In the middle of really a very hellish world in the Congo, which is still in the middle of a war, but it's this center, a revolutionary center for women who have suffered incredible gender violence. And they come and they have been beaten down. Their self-esteem has been destroyed. They literally have bullet holes in their heads. Their bodies have often been completely ruined by gang rapes and mass rapes. They come with some desire to help other people and some desire to be better themselves. Well, in 6 months, these women were at City of Joy in this training program where they learned, you know, how to read and write, where they learned to speak English, where they were healed in therapy, where they learned self-defense, where they learned civics, where they learned to vote. And I was at this graduation where these women were strutting, were speaking from their hearts, were giving speeches like I've never seen any prime minister give, without a page in front of them. It was from their bodies, it was from their spirits, it was from their hearts. And it's a very different kind of power. It's a power that comes from having been there. It's a power that knows what it feels like to be raped or destroyed in war, and to be poor, and to fight your way out of it, and where your concern is for the others and helping them rise the way you've rised. That's a very different power than political power, where you rise and get yourself into a position where you dominate and get the resources and get the goods and get everything, and everybody else is beneath you.
Do you think the word feminism has become a dirty word?
You know, the question's always asked, and it's a funny question to me, because I just can't even imagine. We wouldn't be here, you and I, having this conversation without feminism. We wouldn't be having the conversation. Had feminism not happened, you wouldn't have this job, and no one would be listening to me. It just wouldn't have happened. So it's kind of like saying, is air a dirty word? I mean, I don't understand it. What is feminism? Feminism means that women have the right to equality, that women have a right to voice, a right to equal pay, a right to be present, a right not to be harassed and raped, a right to thrive rather than just survive, a right to have children or not have children, to have desire, to have a lot of sex or have a little sex, whatever their bodies want. What's the problem? I just don't understand what the problem is and why anyone would think feminism is a dirty word. Unless you want to keep all the power and you don't want to share and you don't want to play nicely. But I will say that we really have to look at the fact that 95% of the violence done to women is done by men. 1 out of 3 women on the planet will experience rape or violence in her lifetime. That's 1 billion women. 1 billion women. Now, there are men who are doing that. And I really just want to say to all the good men, if they were busy standing up and speaking to the men who were committing the violence and asking them why, and making violence against women their central issue, and as important, for example, as football is, I bet you violence against women would end very, 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 very rapidement.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.